March 24, 1944. 22,500 feet above the North Sea, on the polar side of a cold, hard sun. The wind at that altitude tasted of metal and oil, sharp and thin. Frost spiderwebbed across cockpit canopies. Breath condensed in puffs when men craned to peer through sight glass and slit. The sky was a pale, brittle blue. Far beneath them lay the gray scales of clouds, and beyond, the low brick and slate geometry of the German industrial heartlands. Factories knifed by rail, dockyards, smokestacks. The smell of warm coffee and grease did not reach this high. Only the mechanical, rhythmic throb of Pratt & Whitney engines and the vibration of airframe resonances. The 8th Air Force box of B-17 Flying Fortresses creaked and groaned in formation, a living, lumbering thing. First Lieutenant Samuel Sam Turner, flight engineer of the lead element, thumbed the oxygen valve with fingers numb from the cold and hollered over the intercom. His voice, amplified through wired steel and tubes, had the hollow, honest timbre of a man who'd learned to talk through roaring turbines. Beside him, Captain Richard Dick Halverson, mission commander of the 303rd Bombardment Group, stared into his Norden bomb sight as if it were scripture. Halverson was a gaunt man with a jaw like a hatchet. He had flown 59 missions and had an iron blue stare that could measure runs of flak before the gunners called them. "We're coming up on the IP," Halverson said. The bombardier, Sergeant Joseph Joe Alvarez, hunched at the bomb site with a cigarette stubbed out long ago between two fingers. In the nose, the chin turret's twin 50s glinted, and a young tail gunner, Private First Class Tommy Larkin, kept watch like a sentry on a cathedral roof. Below, the black silhouettes of plant roofs confirmed the target, a sprawling aircraft assembly complex on the outskirts of Bremen, long, boxy hangars crisscrossing rail spurs, yards of stacked raw materials. Intelligence had reported production lines for a twin-engine fighter-bomber variant and a small run of Heinkel and Focke-Wulf parts. The target's name mattered less today than the thing it represented. The relentless converting of raw steel into wings, into gun barrels, into the long, lethal promise of air superiority. Flak bloomed beneath them first as glittering steel flowers. Clouds of black popped like gunfire against a dark canvas. The fortresses held their line. Flak chewed shallow, nicking wing surfaces and peppering the fuselage. One aircraft in the column called down an engine fault. Halvorsen made the split-second decision that defined air war: maintain formation or fall out and be picked away by fighters. He tightened his lips and kept the formation true. In the box, discipline was the most human thing they possessed. A single Luftwaffe Bf-109 streaked like a wasp across their flank, then another. Soon a single-engine pack danced around them. P-51 Mustangs from the 4th Fighter Group rode the edges of the mission like bulldogs, bright and clean, chasing the Luftwaffe off with machine gun tracery. The exchange was quick and terrible. The smell of cordite uncoiling in the thin air, blue smoke trails, a wing tipping, a flare of fire. In one section, a B-17's number 3 engine went laminar, then died. The plane dropped like a wounded beast. Turner and Halverson felt the collective breath of men held and then released as the crippled fortress eased away toward the English Channel, a white ribbon of smoke marking its misery. Inside the lead ship, the bombardier's hand hovered above the release, a pause in which the fate of yards and lives was carried. Alvarez's voice came through the intercom, low and precise. "Bombs away." The buttresses of the earth answered, thin lines of distant explosions, black and quick as the bombs fell into the belly of an industrial throbbing. For the men in the nose and waist, the blast of parachute flares and the thunder of their own ordnance blurred into a shared sensation, the knowledge that they were part of a system far larger than themselves. They operated not as isolated instincts but as a node within a vast American machine, a machine that began not at the cockpit, but thousands of miles away, in places with names like Seattle, Youngstown, Wichita, and Buffalo, where rivet guns clicked like castanets and conveyor belts moved like arteries. None of that detail was in local view, only the etched geometry of factory roofs, the scabbed scars of bomb craters, and later, the sight of workers' huts and repair sheds blackened by flame told the story on the ground. Yet in the cramped metal privacy of the airplane, men traded small certainties, snippets of mail, a laced-in joke, the muted clack of a rosary between a tail gunner's fingers, the soft rustle of a tin of cookies being passed. Captain Halverson glanced at the crew roster pasted by the navigator's knee, at the names that would be folded into the mission log. He thought of the boys who had not come back from the last run, and of the strange arithmetic of war where engines, planes, and men were constant variables in an expanding calculation. Far below, in factory canteens and concrete offices, men and women turned wrenches and worked presses. Steam hissed in the bowels of foundries. Stamping machines shaped skins for wings. Night shifts threaded themselves into the endless rhythm of production. The noise of it, the hammering, the stamping, the shouted instructions over rolling conveyors, traveled up later in reports, testimonies, the dry accounting of awed German captives. But at 22,500 feet, the sound was different. It was the steady, metallic heartbeat of the B-17, the whine of the turbochargers, and the faint, human murmurs through headphones that linked men together across the vastness of the sky. When the mission turned west for home, the lead element baton was passed to the pilots that would shepherd the stream back across the channel. They rode, exhausted and holy, on the knowledge that their bombs had sought the nodes of a production system. Halverson lodged the image of a single long factory building into his memory. A place where, they said, the Germans might make 20 or 30 aircraft a month. He had no way of knowing the scale yet. That realization came later like a cold reveal, when statements were taken from prisoners and intelligence numbers were cross-checked. For now, beneath the roar in the ice, men did the thing they had been trained to do: keep formation, avoid flak, aim true. The machine of war was both visceral and administrative. A bomber stream was the physical embodiment of how the United States had taught itself to turn industrial muscle into airborne force. And in that fragile whistling hour above Europe, that force felt inexorable. April 2nd, 1944, Stalag Luft I, Barth, Germany. The snow outside the wire fence had the dull color of gunmetal. Inside the compound, the wind carried the dry rustle of paper, interrogation reports, intelligence summaries, and the clipped footfalls of German guards moving with mechanical precision. In a narrow, smoke-filled room that once served as the base commandant's office, 2 Luftwaffe officers stood beside a table strewn with reconnaissance photographs. One of them, Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Bremer, had the long, weather-beaten face of a career pilot. His uniform still smelled faintly of aviation fuel. Across from him sat Hauptmann Otto Lüdke, a staff officer from the Reich Air Ministry's production bureau. Lüdke's hairline had retreated with the war. He wore thick spectacles that caught the light like mirrors. The Americans had been brought in that morning. 3 officers from a downed B-17 captured near Osnabrück. They looked tired, cold, but strangely calm. One, a young lieutenant with a blood-crusted bandage across his temple, answered the interpreter's questions with clipped civility. When Bremer asked, "How many bombers does America build in a month?" the lieutenant blinked once and said quietly, "Enough to replace everything you shoot down, none and then some." Bremer smiled, not out of disbelief but discomfort. "You exaggerate, Lieutenant. Even the United States cannot build such numbers indefinitely." The prisoner shrugged. "Sir, I flew out of Kearney, Nebraska. The plant there turns out liberators so fast they have to store them in cornfields until there's room to fly them out. They're stacking engines like milk crates. You can hear the plants from miles away." There was a pause. The interpreter hesitated before translating. When he did, Lüdke's brow furrowed. He lifted one of the aerial photographs on the table at the twisted ruins of a German airframe plant and studied it as though searching for something that could disprove what he'd just heard. The Luftwaffe's industrial rhythm had once felt unstoppable. Before the war, the Reich's aircraft plants were showcases of precision. Focke-Wulf in Bremen, Messerschmitt in Augsburg, Junkers in Dessau. They were the pride of German engineering, efficient, exacting, masterfully organized. Yet by 1944, that order was being swallowed by entropy. Supply lines had grown brittle, aluminum was scarce, fuel scarcer. Skilled labor had been thinned by conscription, replaced with prisoners and foreign workers. Even the most ambitious programs, like Speer's miracle production plan, buckled under the weight of Allied bombs and bureaucratic exhaustion. Bremer gestured toward a folder stamped Geheim and muttered, "We produce perhaps 300 aircraft a month now, and on good months. Fighters mostly. Bombers are impossible. Our machine tools are tired. Bearings, forgings. There's not enough power even for full shifts." The American lieutenant smiled faintly. In Detroit, he said, one plant, just one, made 500 fighters in a single month. Ford's Willow Run makes a B-24 every 63 minutes. The interpreter stopped again. Even he seemed unwilling to continue. Bremer's face drained of color. Every 63 minutes. It was a phrase that would later appear in debriefs and war diaries, scribbled in margins beside exclamation points and underlined twice. Every hour, another bomber. Every hour, another 4 engines, another 10 men, another ton of aluminum turned into skyborne firepower. Ludka turned toward the window where the gray light of afternoon had begun to thicken into evening. Beyond the wire, a skeletal tree bent under wind that smelled faintly of the Baltic. Every hour, he repeated softly. We make in a month what they make in a day. He didn't say it as a complaint, more as a confession. For the first time since the war began, both men could see the end as something measurable, not through ideology or courage, but through arithmetic, a war of numbers, of pistons, of man-hours. That night in his logbook, Bremer recorded the encounter. His handwriting was thin, precise, officer's script. Interrogation of captured American aircrew suggests U.S. production exceeds 5,000 aircraft monthly. Figures cannot be verified but seem supported by continued Allied operational tempo. If true, then total German replacement capacity 110 U.S. rate. Conclusion: attrition no longer sustainable. He did not write what he actually felt. The hollow silence that followed. The quiet understanding that no amount of personal valor could outrun a machine that could replace itself faster than it could be destroyed. In Berlin, Albert Speer's ministry was already circulating emergency production decrees, shifting workshops underground, consolidating what remained of the nation's manufacturing backbone. But even Speer knew the truth whispered in those interrogation rooms. The war had become a contest between two industrial philosophies, and Germany's had run out of oxygen. Outside Stalag Luftwaffe, the wind carried the faint drone of engines, distant, high, steady. Somewhere over the North Sea, another formation was inbound, another wave of the flying factories. To the guards, it was background noise. To Bremer, it was a heartbeat, the mechanical pulse of inevitability. May 1944, Willow Run, Michigan. The sound came first, a low rolling thunder that never stopped. It was the sound of progress, of metal being tamed by men and women who had never before touched an airplane. The great factory of Willow Run was alive from dawn until dawn again, a city under a roof. Fluorescent lamps hummed overhead. Conveyor belts groaned under the weight of aluminum ribs, fuselage frames, and wing spars. Rows of workers, men in oil-streaked coveralls, women in bright bandanas, moved in synchronized rhythm. Pneumatic hammers bit into rivets with the staccato beat of machine guns. Wrenches sang. The air smelled of lubricant, sweat, and ambition. A single overhead speaker played Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade to the background of industrial percussion. This was the new face of America's war, Eleanor Ellie Sutton, 21 years old and barely 5 feet tall, stood on a scaffold along the assembly line, pressing the trigger of a rivet gun into the belly of a B-24 Liberator. She was one of the Rosies, trained not in flight but in fabrication. Her gloves were patched, her face smudged with dust, but her movements were steady, methodical. To her left, a man from Illinois tightened the fasteners. To her right, a woman from Oklahoma ran inspection checks. Every 45 minutes, the line advanced and a new section of aircraft took shape. Foremen walked the aisles with clipboards marking progress. Engineers in white shirts and rolled sleeves stood by with blueprints rolled under their arms, timing the process, shaving seconds. On catwalks above, supervisors watched the endless mechanical ballet, the largest coordinated manufacturing movement in the world. Willow Run wasn't a factory. It was an organism. It had begun as Henry Ford's bold experiment, a single plant to mass-produce heavy bombers using the same techniques that had once built Model Ts. Now, in its full wartime rhythm, it covered more than 67 acres. It consumed 40 tons of steel and 90,000 gallons of fuel oil each day. Over 40,000 workers labored in shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. At its peak, one completed bomber rolled out of the hangar doors every 63 minutes. When the doors opened and sunlight hit the newly painted wings, men and women would cheer. Sometimes they'd scrawl names on the fuselage: Liberty Bell, Kansas Queen, Detroit Daisy. Each one would fly east, over the Atlantic into the same skies that Halverson and Turner had fought through weeks before. "Next," someone shouted from the floor. The line moved. New parts arrived. The old ones disappeared down the assembly runway that stretched almost a mile. Across the country, the rhythm was the same. Boeing in Seattle, Douglas in Long Beach, North American in Inglewood, Republic in Farmingdale. Factories pulsed like heartbeats, synchronized by telegram, radio, and railroad timetables. Engines arrived from Pratt & Whitney in Connecticut, propellers from Hamilton Standard in Ohio, tires from Firestone in Akron. The U.S. industrial web stretched coast to coast, a lattice of speed, steel, and logistics that no other nation had ever attempted. Each plant had its own sound, its own scent, its own identity. Boeing's halls smelled of paint and cutting oil. Douglas's floors gleamed with wax and ambition. At Inglewood, they said you could hear the entire war being built from a mile away. Yet the real secret wasn't just machinery. It was people. Teenagers fresh out of high school, farmers turned tool makers, grandmothers learning to read blueprints. They worked beside union men, engineers, and immigrants who had arrived from Italy, Poland, Ireland, all fluent in the new universal language of production. America was making planes, but it was also making itself. At night, trains loaded with crated fuselages and wings rumbled eastward under blackout curtains. At ports, cranes lifted them into the holds of Liberty ships. Dockworkers watched the silhouettes disappear into the Atlantic fog and whispered about the faraway places they'd go: England, Italy, North Africa. Back in Michigan, Ellie Sutton finished her shift. She wiped her hands, looked at the bomber rolling out of the hangar, and thought about the men who would fly it. Somewhere she knew her work would keep one of them alive. For her, the war wasn't distant or abstract. It was real and personal, forged in aluminum and sweat. By that spring, America had become what Roosevelt had promised 3 years earlier: the arsenal of democracy. In April alone, American factories produced 8,600 aircraft. By summer, the number would surpass $9,000. To the outside world, these figures were unbelievable. But to those inside the plants, it was simply Tuesday. And while German officers debated figures and possibilities, Willow Run's clocks ticked on. The machines did not rest. Neither did the people. Somewhere above the Atlantic, the men of the 8th Air Force flew in formations so dense that their contrails cast shadows on the clouds below. Each bomber they flew was a child of this roaring, tireless industry, an iron echo of the factories that had become America's greatest weapon. June 1944. Augsburg, Germany. Messerschmitt-Werke. The air inside the underground tunnels was damp and bitter with exhaust fumes. The ventilation system coughed in tired bursts, never quite keeping up with the choking smell of welding smoke. Miners' lamps glowed on the helmets of hundreds of laborers, prisoners, civilians, and the last remaining skilled craftsmen pressed into the service of the Reich. Above them, Allied bombers had turned much of the city into rubble. Whole assembly halls now stood like open skeletons, their roofs peeled away, their machinery buried in twisted rebar. What remained of the Messerschmitt factory had been moved underground into the Kellerwerke, tunnels carved into the hillsides and salt caverns. Here, amid dripping rock walls, Germany tried to keep its air fleet alive. Oberstleutnant Bremer, recently reassigned after his posting at Stalag Luftwaffe, descended a narrow stairway into the half-lit tunnels. He was now serving as liaison between the Luftwaffe's operational command and the Ministry of Armaments. His boots echoed in the wet gloom as he followed a guide past rows of skeletal fuselages, Me-262 jet fighters, the so-called miracle machines. Sleek, predatory, they gleamed under lantern light like sharks sleeping in a cave. A foreman, sleeves rolled up to the elbows and soot streaked across the face, saluted stiffly. "Production continues, Herr Oberstleutnant." But power outages slow the presses. The city's grid was hit again last night. "We have 12 aircraft completed this month." 12? Bremer repeated, the word cracking in the air like a misfire. The foreman nodded. "Of those, only 8 have engines. We're scavenging bearings from damaged JUMO units. Some turbines seize after the first test flight. Materials." He hesitated. Materials arrive irregularly. Spear's men say more trains are coming, but Bremer cut him off with emotion. He understood. Everyone did. There were no trains left to spare, no aluminum unclaimed, no copper unneeded elsewhere. Even paint had become a luxury. As they moved through the line, Bremer saw the faces of the workers, gaunt, hollow-eyed, lips cracked from lack of sleep and stale air. Some wore tattered overcoats over striped prison uniforms. They worked without complaint, their movements mechanical, their fatigue beyond language. The steady ping-ping-ping of hammering metal echoed off the walls like a slow heartbeat. A supervisor leaned close and whispered, "Berlin says these jets will turn the tide. 1 Me-262 equals 5 Allied fighters." Bremer stared at the half-finished fuselage before him. "Yes," he said quietly, "but they make 5 before we finish one." The supervisor didn't reply. Later, in the makeshift administrative office, a concrete alcove lit by a single buzzing bulb, Bremer read the latest production reports. He'd seen them before, every month more desperate than the last. April. Total aircraft 19975 down 28%. May total aircraft 1422 down 46%. June total aircraft 998 projected. Meanwhile, intelligence intercepts claimed the Americans were now building close to 9,000 planes per month. The numbers felt unreal, obscene, as if the enemy were multiplying by magic. He rubbed his temples and closed the folder. In the silence he heard distant rumbling, faint but unmistakable, the echo of another air raid far off, maybe Munich or Regensburg. It seemed the sky itself was crumbling. That evening, he met with Hauptmann Lüdke again, now assigned to oversee material requisitions. Lüdke had aged 10 years and 3 months. His spectacles were cracked, his uniform frayed. "They tell us to move production deeper underground," Lüdke said, voice low, weary. "But where? Every tunnel we dig costs steel and labor we don't have. The Americans don't need to hide their factories. They build in daylight in open fields and no one dares touch them." Bremer stared into his coffee. Bitter, black, stretched with barley. "You've seen the reports," he said. "They have machines that stamp entire wing panels in one press. We cut ours by hand. We still trace our ribs with chalk." Lüdke nodded grimly. "And they have oil. We have hope." Outside, rain mixed with the soot of distant fires. The air stank of wet ash. For years, German engineers had built with perfection in mind. Tolerances measured in thousandths. Craftsmanship prized above all else. But perfection takes time. Mass production demands speed. The Americans, the British, even the Soviets had sacrificed artistry for replication. They built not planes, but a process. A rhythm that could not be bombed, could not be frightened. Inside those dripping tunnels, surrounded by the ghosts of their own precision, Bremer and Lüdke realized they had lost not in courage but in method. That night, as Allied aircraft passed overhead on their way to bomb the Ruhr, the underground lights flickered and dimmed. Bremer stepped outside and looked toward the sky, though he could see nothing but clouds and firelight. He listened to the distant hum of engines, thousands of them, overlapping like waves. It was not the sound of a single raid anymore. It was the sound of an empire of production in motion, a nation that could replace in a week what Germany lost in a season. For the first time, Bremer did not curse the noise. He simply listened, understanding what it meant. August 12, 1944. Over France, 24,000 feet. The sunlight over the Cotentin Peninsula had the sharp, polished clarity of a lens. Below, the countryside unfolded like a green quilt stitched with roads and rivers. But to the men of the 8th Air Force, it was only coordinates and vectors, grid squares on a map they would never touch. Captain Richard Halverson, now promoted to major, sat in the left seat of a new B-17G. The paint was still fresh, the controls smooth. His crew was younger this time, boys barely out of flight school. Most of them had never seen combat before. Yet their plane, stamped only 6 weeks earlier in Seattle, was one of hundreds joining the day's mission, a strike on synthetic oil refineries at Merseburg. "Check formation," Halverson said, his voice calm, deliberate. Outside his canopy, silver wings glittered in all directions. The bomber stream stretched for nearly 70 miles. At its core flew the veterans. At the edges, the replacements. In total, over 1,500 heavy bombers were in the air that morning. escorted by 800 P-51 Mustangs. It was an airborne city. Halverson knew what this meant. Not just the destruction of targets, but the manifestation of the United States industrial soul. Each fortress represented tens of thousands of hours of labor. Factory girls, machinists, welders, engineers. Every engine in the air was the echo of an assembly line still running somewhere beyond the Atlantic. To the Germans watching from the ground, the sky itself seemed to thicken with the noise. Villagers pointed upward, shading their eyes. Soldiers stopped in their tracks to stare. It was not a single formation anymore, but a moving continent. Metal, sunlit, inevitable. Inside one of the flak towers outside Magdeburg, Oberstleutnant Bremer watched through binoculars as the sky darkened with contrails. His aide stood beside him, pale and sweating. "There are too many," the aide murmured. "Count them," Bremer ordered, though he knew it was pointless. He lowered the binoculars slowly. The horizon shimmered white with vapor trails as far as the eye could see. Each line was a story, a machine born in Detroit or Seattle, tended by mechanics in England, flown by men who'd never seen the continent they were destroying. The first waves of flak began to rise. Black bursts rolled through the blue like ink stains. A few bombers wavered, but the formation closed ranks, seamless, disciplined. The stream did not break. It could not. Bremer turned to his aide. This is no Air Force," he said quietly. "It's an industry with wings." Down in the cities, workers scrambled for shelters. The hum became a roar. The roar became thunder. Bomb doors opened in perfect unison. At Merseburg, where the Luna synthetic fuel plant sprawled across 250 acres, the first bomb struck at 10:17 a.m. A heartbeat later, the entire complex vanished under a rolling sea of flame. Storage tanks erupted, sending pillars of smoke tens of thousands of feet into the air. The shockwave cracked windows 15 miles away. In the cockpit of Halverson's B-17, the blast reflected off the underside of the clouds, a silent flash of orange. "Target hit," Alvarez, the bombardier, reported over the intercom. His voice trembled not from fear but awe. They turned west for home. Behind them, the refinery burned like a wounded star. By the time the last bomber crossed the channel that afternoon, German fuel production had dropped by nearly 40%. Within weeks, Luftwaffe squadrons would be grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Fighter pilots would train in simulators and bicycles for want of engines. Halverson's fortress touched down in East Anglia just before sunset, its landing gear groaning as it rolled across the pierced steel matting. Mechanics swarmed over the plane before its engines even stopped turning. Fuel hoses, oil cans, wrenches, everything appeared instantly as if conjured. The machine would be patched, refueled, rearmed, and ready again within 24 hours. The next morning, he walked into the mission briefing hut. On the wall hung a new list: today's targets, tomorrow's, and the day after that. Dozens of crews gathered, drinking coffee, checking maps, joking as if the war were a job, which, in a way, it was. Halverson studied the map and realized something extraordinary. The targets were shrinking. There was less and less of Germany left to hit. In Augsburg, Bremer received the day's casualty report from the Reich Air Ministry. The figures were grim. Of the fighters scrambled to intercept, nearly half had been destroyed or lost contact. Pilots were untrained. Engines failed mid-climb. There was not enough fuel even for retrieval. He stared at the numbers until they blurred. Later that night, he stood outside his billet, staring into the darkness where the fires of Merseburg still flickered faintly beyond the horizon. Somewhere in the black sky, the steady drone of American bombers echoed again, returning for another target. Bremer exhaled slowly, the air cold against his teeth. "We're fighting a factory," he whispered to himself. "And it never sleeps." He wasn't wrong. Back in the United States, even as those bombers returned, new ones were already rolling off the assembly lines. Fresh paint, fresh crews, fresh determination. The conveyor belts never stopped. The rivet guns never cooled. The war in the air was no longer just about courage, or tactics, or luck. It was about tempo, and America's tempo had become divine. May 1945, Bavaria. The snow had melted into the roads, leaving behind rivers of mud that glistened beneath the spring sun. Germany was broken, Not metaphorically, but physically. Rail lines lay twisted and blackened. Bridges were piles of stone. The once proud cities of the Reich were reduced to skeletons of brick and smoke. At what had once been an airfield near Landsberg, the silence was strange. No engines. No air raid sirens. No hammering of anti-aircraft guns. Just the wind moving through the hollowed hangars and the ticking of cooling metal. Oberstleutnant Karl-Heinz Bremer stood beside a ruined Me-262, its wings riddled with bullet holes, its fuselage half buried in mud. Around him, American soldiers, the advanced patrols of the 12th Armored Division, were cataloging equipment, photographing the wreckage and shaking their heads. A sergeant from Ohio picked up a steel plate marked Messerschmitt AG, Augsburg, and turned it over in his hands. "Hell of a thing," he muttered. "They built these in caves." Bremer said nothing. He simply watched as a U.S. major, clipboard in hand, khaki uniform still creased from the long drive south, approached with polite caution. "Colonel Bremer, isn't it?" the American asked. "We've been told you oversaw some of the Luftwaffe's production facilities." Bremer nodded once. His face was pale, lips cracked. The insignia had been torn from his cap. The major gestured toward the airfield ruins. "We've seen your factories. Impressive engineering considering, well, the situation." He hesitated, as if reluctant to sound victorious. "You kept building even under constant bombing." Bremer managed a faint, bitter smile. "Yes, we built. But you manufactured." The American frowned, unsure. Bremer continued, his voice thin but steady. "We made aircraft like watchmakers craft clocks. You made them like bakers make bread." The major let the words settle. Behind them, the sound of trucks and voices filled the air. American soldiers were unloading crates of food, medical kits, cigarettes, the early gestures of occupation. The war had ended less than a week earlier, yet the machinery of peace was already humming. Bremer turned his gaze toward the western horizon, where the contrails of high-altitude reconnaissance planes drifted faintly across the sky. The same sky that had once been thick with bombers. "I saw your formations," he said quietly. "When they came, it was like the sky had turned to metal. We thought we could outfly you, outfight you, but every time we destroyed one of your machines, 3 more appeared. We couldn't understand it. None of us could. How could you make so many?" The major exhaled through his nose, thinking of Detroit and Seattle, of the women in overalls and the midnight shifts. "We didn't win because we were better pilots," he said. "We won because we built faster than anyone thought possible." Bremer nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "We realized that too late. When your prisoners told us of your factories, how they made more planes in a month than we did in a year, we laughed at first. Then we stopped laughing." He knelt beside the Me-262's broken wing, running a gloved hand over the cold metal. "Our miracle machines," he murmured. "They came too late. Even the jets couldn't outrun production." The American major looked down, unsure what to say. Around them, the soldiers had started collecting the Luftwaffe's last remnants, machine parts, propellers, fragments of history soon to be crated and sent home as evidence of victory. A convoy rumbled past the airfield, each truck marked with a white star. Bremer watched it go, the endless procession of supply, movement, purpose. It was the same rhythm he'd seen in the war's final months, except now it carried bread instead of bombs. He straightened, fatigue in every line of his posture. "You know," he said almost to himself, "our engineers believed we could win through ingenuity. But you won through multiplication." The major adjusted his cap. "Our factories fought the war before our soldiers did," he replied. Bremer smiled faintly, not in mockery but in understanding. "Then they were your greatest generals." The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of church bells from a nearby village, the first he'd heard in years. For a moment, both men stood in silence, listening. Beyond the airfield, fields of wrecked aircraft stretched in every direction. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, Heinkels, all of them burned, broken, defeated not by superior machines but by superior production. In the coming months, as Allied investigators tallied the ruins and collected intelligence, one report from a captured German officer would circulate among American command staff. It was written in careful script, signed simply K.H. Bremer. "Our defeat was not due to lack of courage or invention. It was due to the enemy's capacity to reproduce his strength faster than we could destroy it. We fought men, they fought with industries." By the time the report reached Washington, Willow Run had already halted bomber production. The factory was quiet for the first time in 3 years. The rivet guns were still, the lights dimmed, the conveyors motionless. Yet its legacy lingered in every rusting airframe scattered across Europe, proof that America's true weapon had not been a single bomb or bullet, but the machine that made them all. And in the calm after the storm, when the last echoes of the war faded into memory, the lesson remained simple, brutal, and unforgettable. In the age of total war, the side that could build faster than it could bleed would always win.